Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So today I want to talk about one and only, the untold story of On the Road. So what this book is, it's a transcribed interview that the author, Gerald Nicosia, had with LuAnne Henderson, who is the character Mary Lou in the story On the Road. And when I first picked up this book, I was kind of skeptical. I didn't really know what story LuAnne had to tell. I mean, I feel like I knew her story very well from On the Road. I thought it was a very straightforward story, and there wasn't much depth to her character. But reading this interview, you definitely see there's a lot more to her, a lot of perspective she had to give about Jack Kerouac, Neal, Cassady, and just the overall story of On the Road. I definitely think changes the way you see On the Road in a very big way. And I feel like a lot of times with the Beat Generation, the Beat Generation is a group of authors, mainly men authors, who told their story. You don't really hear a very strong woman perspective of the Beat Generation. I mean, most of them have written autobiographies at this point. I mean, Carol Cassady has a very well-known book, Off the Road, and all of Jack Kerouac's wives have at this point written stories about their lives. But LuAnne Henderson, she's one of the women in the Beat Generation who never wrote her story. She never had a book that she published about her life, about the Beat Generation. So it's definitely refreshing, I think, to get her perspective on the story. And this book talks a lot about Carol and Cassady's biography, definitely compares LuAnne's story to Carolyn's story in a very big way. Because I feel like Carol and Cassady is very critical of LuAnne. She definitely doesn't portray her in a very good light in her biography. And I would say this story doesn't really portray Carol and Cassady very well. So, I mean, there's definitely a rivalry between Carol and Cassady and LuAnne Henderson throughout their lives. They were both, wives of Neal Cassady. So there was always tension there. And it was definitely interesting hearing her perspective, letting her tell her story, separate from just Carol and Cassady telling the story of what happened. But what this book does really well, LuAnne, she doesn't really tell her story. She tells the perspective of the overall story of Jack and Neal. So I think that's definitely an important thing to note. I feel like Carol and Cassady, I feel like sometimes in her writing she's very a little self-centered. She just kind of talks about herself quite a bit, which is fine. But I just feel like with LuAnne's story, with her the transcription of her interview, she's not really telling her story so much as she's just telling her opinions, her reflections on the road, Jack Kerouac and Neal Cassady. But reading this book, after reading this, you definitely see that LuAnne is definitely really one of the central figures in On the Road, because she's the one who got Neal on this journey heading out to New York. And she was with Neal when they went back to the East Coast to find Jack in North Carolina and take them back to San Francisco. So she definitely was a very central figure in all of their journeys that they had. And hearing her tell her story definitely makes you reflect on that a little better. Because I mean, it's very obvious that she's part of, a central part of the story On the Road, but hearing her tell her side of the story definitely, I think, makes it a little more clear of who she was in On the Road. And one thing I didn't like about this book is that in a lot of LuAnne's telling of her story, there's a lot of discrepancies in her storytelling. I mean, the author makes very clear that there's discrepancies. They talk quite a bit about her discrepancies, things that she gets wrong or not quite right. But I also think that I definitely noticed reading this book that, when you look at various, people's telling of the same events, from Carol and Cassady's story to the events of On the Road to LuAnne's story, you definitely see the story is told slightly different in different people's perspectives. So I think that's just part of having, 4 or 5 books, talking about the same events. You're going to have discrepancies. But yeah, that's definitely one thing I noticed. I mean, not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it just says a lot about when you have multiple people telling the same story, you're going to have discrepancies. So I think it's kind of interesting to see that in a way. But one thing this book does really well, it definitely portrays the Beat Generation, Jack, Neal, LuAnne, as just being normal people. And there wasn't really anything special about them. I mean, they had very complicated lives, very interesting lives, but they were really just normal people. They were people in the 40s and 50s. I think they were really good reflections of people in that time period, but they were just people who didn't fit in, people who were a little weird, a little different, didn't quite fit in with the conformity of the 1950s. And this book has a lot of photographs of the characters of LuAnne, Jack and Neal. And they look like very much just people from the 40s and 50s. They don't look like counterculture people that you think of like in the 60s, everyone wearing tie-dye. That really wasn't a thing back then. I mean, counterculture was just developing. It was really started with just people who were just a little different than everyone else in the 1950s and lived very complicated lives. They didn't really conform to the conformity of the 1950s. But this book talks about, highlights quite a few events that occurred on the road and, other events throughout, LuAnne Henderson's life. But it talks about this one scene that's on the road. They get pulled over by the police. I believe they're in either Virginia or North Carolina. They were on this trip where they picked up Jack in 1949 and went back to the West Coast. It talks about how the police officer pulled them over and he's questioning all of them. And, as you know, Neal tells that they're going to see his wife in California. And then they question LuAnne and she says, oh, well, Neal's my wife. So, and the police officer was kind of just baffled by the complexity of this, when he finds out that, she's his ex-wife, and he's like, what are you doing with your ex-wife? You're going to see your wife out in California. And that really, I think, just highlights how, that was very unusual back then. It was unusual for someone to have a complicated life like that, to be with their ex-wife, going to see their current wife. And I think that really just highlights what these people in Beat Generation were. They were just people who were very much a part of the 1950s, but just slightly different, just living a very separate life to the events that everyone knows, throughout the 1950s. And getting back to the topic of marriage, this book definitely, I think, shows how, the people in the Beat Generation, Jack Kerouac, Cassady, LuAnne Henderson, they all had multiple spouses. They all had, LuAnne was, I think, married 4 or 5 times, and Jack Kerouac had 3 different wives. Cassady had 3 different wives. So marriage was something very different to these people. They really didn't look at marriage in the traditional way that people did in the 1950s. I feel like marriage was kind of a tool to them. It was a tool for them to just find kicks in life, just find their next adventure, just find the next, big thing that was in their life. It wasn't about, long-term commitments. And I think that's definitely what counterculture definitely became, 1960s, just people living in the moment and not really having long-term plans, just kind of going with the flow. And that's definitely what the Beats did. They just kind of went from relationship to relationship, marriage to marriage, without really thinking too much about the rest of their lives. I think the biggest event that LuAnne tells in an interview, the most prominent event that she talks about, is this moment where Cassady abandoned Jack Kerouac and LuAnne when they got to San Francisco at the end of their trip across the country. And she talks about how Neal kind of just left them there with no money, no food, no home, and he just kind of dragged LuAnne and Jack across the country and back, and then just kind of left them there with nothing to give them. And it just kind of, I think that definitely had a big impact on LuAnne, had a big impact on Jack Kerouac. And I think in the book On the Road definitely talks about how of a monumental event that was in their lives. But what I find kind of interesting about that is that, I think in the book On the Road, it definitely portrays that as a very, negative thing in their lives, a very, negative event. But in this book, it really talks about how, just a couple weeks later, they were back with Neal, back hanging with Neal. Neal, picked them up and was back with them, back hanging out with them around San Francisco. So, it couldn't have been that traumatic of experience if they're back hanging out with him again a couple weeks later. But I think what that really gets at is that, Neal was a very possessive person. He kind of was a very magnetic figure. People were drawn to him, even though he was not a very nice person. Because Neal did this again to Jack. He, dumped him in Mexico City, and then end of On the Road, Jack and Neal have their trip to Mexico, and Jack gets sick, and Neal just kind of abandons him there in Mexico City and goes back to New York. So, Neal's not a very nice person in the way that he just kind of uses people. He's very manipulative, and this book also talks about how, there's quite a bit of predatory behavior that he exhibits throughout his life. A lot of terrible things he does to LuAnne, who I think a lot of these things, though they are a lot of criminal acts that he does, throughout his life to different people. And I think a lot of this predatory behavior that Cassady portrayed throughout his life is definitely glossed over. I mean, it's definitely talked about in all the different stuff you read about the Beat Generation, but I feel like people tend just to talk about it, address it, and then kind of move on. They don't really analyze it. I think it's definitely something that needs to be analyzed a little more. And reading this book definitely made me think quite a bit about it. It definitely, I think, changed the way you see Cassady. Because I feel like people, Cassady is this muse that people admire and look at him, and they want to find art in his life. And by focusing on these terrible things that he did, it kind of takes away from that. But I definitely think it's something that needs to be addressed a little more in literature on the Beat Generation. And despite this book covering some of the negative aspects of Cassady, talks about how LuAnne well, she talks quite a bit about finding good things in Neal to love, really trying to portray him in a good way. But I just feel like that's kind of overshadowed by a lot of the bad things he did. And she talks about how Neal is a non-violent person, except to me. I mean, it's kind of weird that she's talking about how he's a non-violent person. I mean, you hear that quite a bit, how he was a fairly non-violent person. I mean, it's well noted he had many various moments where he kind of had violent outbursts. But she just kind of talks about his violence as just being emotion. No, he was just emotional. And it just sounds like a very typical abusive relationship where people just kind of try to justify the violent actions of their spouse. So definitely interesting to read about. And I feel like Neal Cassady, the way that he could be so mean to people, so bad to people, and people still admired him. He has a very cult-like persona to him. People were just kind of drawn to him, and he became this kind of mythic figure in people's lives. And he just kind of reminds me of a cult leader. I mean, he's not a cult leader by any means, but just the way he was a very magnetic person. People were just kind of drawn to him, and he was just this person that people were just obsessed with. And it's definitely interesting to read about, especially when he went to New York. And he kind of just, as soon as he came to New York, he kind of immediately became this person that people were just obsessing over. And I feel like he kind of manipulated people to draw himself into this group, and he kind of became the leader of this beat community. People just kind of followed him around the country to wherever he was. Jack, all of his most of his cross country trips are going to see Neal, and he's just a very central part of their lives. I feel like he kind of manipulated people to get to that point where he was this central person in the Beat generation. And this book also talks about how Neal kind of set up LuAnne and Jack when he dumped them off in San Francisco. He kind of liked to, I think, set Jack up with all of his lovers, and he tends to do that quite a bit. This is not the only case of him doing that. If you read about Neal's life, you see many times he's always trying to set up Jack with his wife or his lover at the time, and it's definitely kind of possessive. He just kind of wants to control people's lives in a way. It's kind of strange when you really think about some of the things that he did throughout his life. And despite all that, Neal Cassady is definitely still someone who people admire. They definitely still look at him in a very positive way. Even Jack, it talks about On the Road how, I think at one point he says he tries to find saints in the madmen, just kind of tries to find good things in people who aren't necessarily nice people on paper. But Neal Cassady is just not really a nice person. It's interesting how he still is such a person people are interested in. And I think he's kind of still, after he's long gone, still manipulating people, still making himself this central figure in the Beat generation. And it's definitely interesting. And I think Neal, in a way, really represents the death of counterculture in a way, because he was very self-destructive, but I think he represents both the positive and negative of the counterculture, especially in the 1960s, because he was this person that people admired. He definitely was a very central person with the Merry Band of Pranksters, but this cult-like persona that he had, this ability to manipulate people, be very possessive, I think also kind of foreshadows a lot of the negative things of counterculture, especially people like Charles Manson, who were able to manipulate people. I mean, obviously I'm not comparing him to Charles Manson, but you see that tendency that there was, I think, in counterculture in the 1960s to be drawn to people, be drawn to very magnetic people, because people were anti-conformist. They didn't want to conform to what everyone else is doing. So I think people who think that way are very likely to be drawn to someone with a very cult-like persona. And there's definitely some elements of that in Neal Cassady's personality and who he was. But ultimately, I think Neal Cassady was a very self-destructive person who he kind of created his own demise. He was just go, and eventually it just killed him. Eventually he was just doing so many drugs, just doing so much speed, just constantly moving that it just killed him. And as LuAnne talks about a lot of Neal Cassady's self-destructive tendencies, she compares Neal quite a bit to Jack Kerouac, because Jack Kerouac was very, very self-destructive person as well. And she talks about how, as she knew Jack Kerouac in his later years, he became a very opinionated, very angry person, especially when he was drunk. He just kind of fell into alcoholism in the same way that Neal fell into all the drug use that he did in the 1960s. And LuAnne talks quite a bit about how Jack was just a very lost person. He never really quite found himself. Even when he became a successful author, he never really found himself, and he was always very dependent on his mother, which I've talked about in other videos, how he kind of goes all around the country, travels, becomes this famous author, but he just goes back to his mother. He still lives with his mother. He can never find a marriage that works for him. He's always jumping from spouse to spouse, but always going back to his mother in the end. And also this book, or LuAnne talks about how both Jack and Neal kind of became performers in the end. Because Jack became a performer, being a famous author, he was expected to be seen a certain way. And he really struggled with that. He really struggled with appearing on TV, being in interviews. And Neal Cassady as well definitely struggled with the fame that he had. I feel like he talks about how Neal Cassady was kind of a performer when he was with the Merry Band of Pranksters, because his need to become a performer kind of came from the book On the Road, becoming this. Jack Kerouac turned him into this character, Dean Moriarty, and Neal kind of felt this desire or this need to live up to the character Dean Moriarty, and that ultimately kind of destroyed him, I think, in the end. But reading about how complex the life of Neal Cassady was, how complex the life of LuAnne Henderson, all these people in the Beat Generation was, you definitely see why Jack Kerouac was drawn to these people, why he wanted to write about them. Because they were just very interesting people. They had this thing called it. Neal Cassady talks about finding it, which is really just living in the moment. And these people really just plunged into adventure without knowing where it would go, what was on the other side. Just, they just wanted adventures for the sake of having adventures, and just sought out new experiences just for the sake of having new experiences and seeing where it led to. But yeah, it was definitely nice having LuAnne's perspective. She definitely gave me a lot of insights into Jack Kerouac, into Neal Cassady, just into the Beat Generation as a whole. But what this book does, it also talks about how much work went into the movie On the Road and trying to portray the character Mary Lou, or the real life LuAnne Henderson, and how much research went into it, how Kristen Stewart, who played Mary Lou in the film, how much she relied on this interview to learn about LuAnne and try to portray her. But I feel like what this book does, it definitely shows how, talking about Kristen Stewart portraying the character Mary Lou, she really made a point to portray the real LuAnne, not quite the Mary Lou of the story. Because I feel like the Mary Lou in On the Road is this kind of a ditzy character, but there was so much more depth to her that Jack Kerouac left out. And Kristen Stewart really tried to portray that depth and really tried to portray the real LuAnne. Because I feel like there's also a lot of criticism of, I've seen a Kristen Stewart's portrayal of Mary Lou in the movie On the Road, how she didn't really represent the character that we all know from the story. I think that was very intentional. She wasn't trying to just portray Mary Lou from On the Road. She was trying to portray the real life LuAnne, kind of take those two characters, put them together to really give the viewer a really good understanding of who the character was. And at the very end of this book, Anne Marie Santos, the daughter of LuAnne Henderson, it tells her little story there at the end. It definitely gives a good perspective on LuAnne's story, because LuAnne mostly just talks about Jack and Neal throughout her interview, and definitely her daughter, I think, gives a little more insight into her actual life. But it also talks about how, I found it interesting, how Anne Marie, she was actually in the movie On the Road. She was a body double for Kristen Stewart at one point, at one of the last scenes in the movie. So I think that's kind of fitting. It kind of brings the story full circle, where LuAnne's daughter is portraying the character Mary Lou in the story On the Road, and it definitely, I think, interesting to read about. This is the first book I've read about the Beat Generation that came out after the movie On the Road came out. I think there's definitely a lot of interesting stuff to be told about the movie On the Road. I definitely would like to read a little more about the development of the movie, how they try to portray all these characters. It was definitely interesting reading about how they portrayed LuAnne Henderson and how much work went into trying to portray her character as best as they could. But yeah, definitely a very interesting read. I'm glad I read this. When I first picked up, like I said, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't really know what story LuAnne had to tell, but after reading this, I think it's definitely one of the most insightful interviews I've ever read about the characters in On the Road and the Beat Generation. So yeah, definitely would recommend this book. The author did a really good job having an interview in there, transcribing it, and giving his own reflections and insights into the Beat Generation and LuAnne Henderson. So yeah, that's one and only, The Untold Story of On the Road. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next book review.